The roof of Brierley Hall had caved in 2 winters ago, taking the grand chandelier and the last of the family's pride with it. When the Duke of Alverton surveyed the damp, rotting timber, he sneered. "It will be a ruin within a year." He laughed, offering a pittance for the land. He didn't know Josephine Linfield. A year later, Brierley wasn't a ruin. It was the finest house in England. And the Duke wasn't laughing anymore. He was begging for a dance. Rainwater did not just fall in Brierley Hall, it intruded. It sneaked through the cracked slate of the roof, crept along the decaying plaster of the upper ceilings, and dripped with a mocking, rhythmic plink into a rusted tin bucket in the center of the grand drawing room. Josephine Linfield stood beside the bucket, her breath pluming in the freezing draught. She was 26, dressed in mourning black that had faded to a dull charcoal at the seams, and entirely alone. Her father, the Earl, had been buried 3 days prior. He had left her a title devoid of respect, a ledger filled with red ink, and Brierley Hall. The house smelled of wet ash, mice, and generations of neglect. The silk wallpaper, once a vibrant French blue, peeled away in long, jaundiced strips like dead skin. Tragic, really. The voice came from the doorway, deep and entirely devoid of actual sympathy. Josephine didn't jump. She merely turned her head. Simon Northcott, the Duke of Alverton, stood in the archway. He was a man carved from pragmatism. His wealth was vast. His lands bordered Brierley to the east and south, and his patience for sentimentality was notoriously non-existent. He wore a heavy riding coat tailored to a brutal perfection, and his boots, expensive polished leather, were currently tracking mud onto her ruined parquet floor. "Your Grace," Josephine said, her voice flat. "I do not recall an invitation." "The front door was off its hinges, Lady Josephine. I assumed a casual drop-in was acceptable." Simon stepped further into the room, his dark eyes sweeping over the water damage, the shrouded furniture, and finally settling on her. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her the way a butcher looks at a particularly scrawny calf. "The door is swollen from the damp," she corrected, clasping her cold hands together in front of her. "It is merely stuck." "It is rotting," Simon replied, tapping his riding crop against his thigh. He walked over to the grand fireplace, entirely ignoring her icy demeanor. He kicked a fallen piece of masonry with the toe of his boot. It crumbled into dust. "The foundation is sinking. The east wing is a stiff breeze away from a total collapse. Your father, God rest his negligent soul, bled this estate dry. You did not ride 2 miles in the freezing rain to critique my masonry, Alverton." Simon turned to face her. His expression was a mask of bored calculation. "I came to offer you an escape. £3,000 for the estate, the land, and whatever timber is left standing. It is more than generous. It will allow you to take a modest cottage in Bath. You can play cards with the other spinsters and forget this place ever existed." Josephine stared at him. £3,000. It was a fraction of what the land alone was worth, but they both knew it was 3,000 more than her father's creditors would leave her if they forced a sale. "Brierley has been in my family for 300 years, she said quietly. "And in 300 days it will be a pile of rubble." Simon countered. He stepped closer. He smelled of rain, leather, and an infuriating arrogance. "You have no money, Josephine. You have no husband to fund this folly. You cannot knit a roof back together." "I am not selling." Simon stopped. He looked down at her, searching her face for the punchline of a joke he hadn't heard. When he found only a brittle, white-knuckled resolve, his lips twitched. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound in the empty room. "You are serious," he said, wiping a droplet of rain from his jaw. "You are going to play at being a builder." "I am going to restore my home." Simon shook his head, the amusement fading into something harder, something profoundly cynical. He'd reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of parchment. He tossed it onto a dust-covered side table. "That is the contract. My solicitor drafted it this morning. Sign it when the rats finally drive you out." He turned on his heel, his boots echoing heavily on the floorboards. Pausing at the ruined doorway, he looked back over his shoulder. "It will be a ruin within a year," he said, his voice dropping the humor, leaving only a cold promise. "And when it is, I will buy it for half of what I offered today." Josephine watched him walk away. She listened to the sound of his horse galloping off down the muddy drive. Then she walked over to the side table, picked up the Duke's contract, and calmly folded it into a thick wedge. She walked to the window and shoved the parchment into a large crack in the frame, blocking the draft. "Right," Josephine whispered to the empty room. "Let's get to work." The reality of restoration did not involve sweeping romantic gestures. It involved dust. Fine, choking, centuries-old dust that settled in Josephine's eyelashes and tasted like chalk. By the end of the first month, her mourning gowns were ruined. She had taken to wearing an old pair of her father's tweed trousers beneath a heavy linen apron, her hair tied back with a rough piece of twine. She had sold the family silver in London. She sold her mother's emeralds, the remaining horses, and the antique tapestries that hadn't yet been eaten by moths. The funds yielded exactly enough to pay off her father's immediate debts and hire a crew of 15 local men. She did not hire a gentleman architect from the city. She hired Elias Dawson, a gruff 60-year-old master mason from the village who drank too much cider but knew the local stone better than he knew his own children. "The joists in the east wing are spongy, Lady Josephine," Dawson said on a grim Tuesday morning, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the weeds. "Can't patch 'em. Gotta replace 'em. Will cost another 50 quid in timber alone." Josephine did not flinch. She simply scratched a line into her ledger. "Order the timber, Mr. Dawson. I will have the funds by Friday." She didn't know how she would get the funds, but she would. She was on her hands and knees in the main hall, using a rusted putty knife to scrape away the hardened, black rot from the baseboards when the front door swung open. Simon walked in. He stopped dead in his tracks. For a long moment, the Duke of Alverton simply stared. Josephine was coated in grey dust. There was a smudge of grease across her cheekbone, and her hands were encased in thick canvas work gloves. She looked like a chimney sweep. "Good God," Simon murmured. "Have the creditors repossessed your maid? Or are you punishing yourself for some unknown sin?" Josephine sat back on her heels, groaning internally as her stiff knees protested. "Did you lose your way, Your Grace? The road to London is in the opposite direction. I came to see if you had come to your senses." Simon walked slowly into the hall, looking up at the scaffolding that now dominated the ceiling. Men were shouting above them, the sound of hammers echoing like gunfire. "Though it appears you have lost them entirely. Trousers, Josephine? Really? If the Ton could see you now—" "If the Ton could see me now, they would ask for a loan, considering how much they all owe their tailors." She fired back, standing up and wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. Simon's eyes tracked the movement. He noticed the red, raw skin at her wrists where the gloves chafed. A strange, uncomfortable flicker of something. Annoyance, he told himself, flared in his chest. "This is a farce. You are bleeding out money you don't have to put a bandage on a corpse. It's not a corpse. The bones are good. The bones are Woodworm and Pride." Simon closed the distance between them. He was tall, his presence demanding and suffocating in the dusty hall. "I heard you sold the Linfield silver." "News travels fast when people have nothing better to do than gossip. You are cannibalizing your family's history to save a shell of a house." Simon's voice hardened. He wasn't mocking her now, he was angry. It baffled him. Why wouldn't she just yield? Why did she have to stand there, looking ragged and feral and entirely unbroken? When the money runs out, and it will, you will have nothing left to sell, not even your pride. Josephine stepped into his space. She was a foot shorter, smelling of lye and sweat, but she didn't shrink. "My pride," she said softly, her eyes blazing, "is none of your concern. This house is mine. I will lay the bricks myself if I have to. Now, unless you brought a hammer, Duke, get out of my hallway. You are blocking the light." Simon stared down at her. He could see a pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat, beneath the collar of her ruined work shirt. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to force her to see reason. Instead, he turned without a word and walked out. But as he rode back to his own immaculate, perfectly heated estate, Simon realized he couldn't stop thinking about the smudge of grease on her cheek. He poured himself a glass of brandy in his library, staring into the fire. She was going to fail. It was an absolute certainty. Yet for the first time in his life, Simon Northcott felt a sickening dread that he might be wrong. By late November, the romantic notion of restoration was dead, frozen solid by an early, brutal winter. The cold in Brierley Hall was an entity. It sank into the stone, curled around the ankles, and settled deep in the lungs. Josephine's hands were permanently cracked, her nails chipped and split. The funds had dwindled to a terrifyingly small pile of coins in her lockbox. She had sold the library. Thousands of books gone in a day, leaving the shelves looking like hollow, gaping teeth. But the roof was nearly closed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the sky turned the color of bruised iron. The wind picked up, a howling gale coming off the moors. Josephine was in the courtyard, helping Dawson and two younger lads haul massive slate tiles toward the pulley system. "Storm's coming in fast, my lady," Dawson yelled over the wind. "We can't leave the west corner exposed. The water will get under the new beams." "Then we finish it now," Josephine shouted back, grabbing the heavy ropes. The wind shrieked, biting through her thin coat. The rain hit them sideways, icy, stinging pellets that felt like shattered glass. She strained against the rope, hoisting the slate upward. Her muscles screamed. She slipped in the mud, falling hard to her knees, but didn't let go of the line. The rope burned right through her canvas gloves. Suddenly, a large gloved hand clamped down on the rope just above hers. Josephine gasped, looking up. Simon was there. He wasn't wearing his fine riding coat. He wore a heavy wool cloak, already soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. His jaw was set in a furious, rigid line. "Pull, damn it!" he roared over the wind. He hauled on the rope with brutal strength. The slate flew up the side of the house to the waiting masons. "What are you doing here?" Josephine screamed over the gale, struggling to stand in the slick mud. Saving you from drowning in your own stubbornness." Simon snapped. He didn't wait for her to argue. He grabbed the next stack of slate, his muscles straining against the wet wool of his clothes, and shoved it toward the pulley. For an hour, the Duke of Alverton hauled stone in the freezing mud like a common laborer. He didn't speak. He just worked with a terrifying, efficient fury, side by side with Dawson and the village boys, until the final tarp was nailed down and the roof was secure. When it was over, the men scattered to the barns to seek shelter. Josephine stood shivering in the courtyard, her teeth chattering so violently she thought they might crack. Simon turned to her. He was covered in mud. His knuckles were bleeding where he had scraped them against the stone. He looked feral. "Inside," he ordered, his voice raw. He didn't give her a chance to walk. He grabbed her by the elbow and hauled her through the swollen front doors of Brierley Hall. The only dry, partially warm room was the small parlor off the kitchen, where Dawson had managed to fix a single chimney. A meager fire crackled in the grate. Simon dragged her to the hearth and practically threw her towards the heat. "You are an idiot," he breathed heavily, pacing the small room. Water dripped from his nose and chin. A complete, utter fool. You could have been crushed by that slate. You could catch your death of cold. Josephine knelt by the fire, holding her trembling, bleeding hands out to the flames. The pain of the cold thawing was excruciating. "I didn't ask for your help. If I hadn't been riding past, you'd be in the mud right now. Why were you riding past in a gale, Simon?" she asked, her voice shaking, but the question was sharp. Simon stopped pacing. He stared at her back, at the rigid line of her spine beneath the soaked coat. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't know why he had been riding past. He had been riding past every day for a week, watching the progress from the tree line like a damn spy waiting for her to break. He walked over to the fire and knelt beside her. Up close, he could see she was shivering violently. Without thinking, he unclasped his heavy wool cloak and draped it over her shoulders. The heat of his body still lingered in the fabric. Josephine stiffened, but she didn't pull away. She looked at his hands. They were large, aristocratic hands, currently filthy and bleeding. "Your knuckles," she whispered. Simon looked down at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "It's just a scrape." He looked at her. Her face was pale, smeared with mud and rain, her lips slightly blue. But her eyes were bright, fierce, and incredibly alive. The cynical armor Simon wore every day suddenly felt paper-thin. He had waited months to see her fail. But looking at her now, kneeling in the dirt of her half-ruined house, having just fought a storm with her bare hands, he felt a terrifying shift in his chest. She wasn't a joke anymore. "The roof," Josephine said softly, staring into the flames. "It's closed." Simon swallowed hard. The silence between them grew heavy, thick with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and something unspoken that neither was ready to name. "Yes," Simon said quietly, his voice losing its customary bite. "The roof is closed." He didn't leave right away. They sat there by the dying fire, the Duke and the pauper lady, as the storm raged against the newly secured stones of Brierley Hall. And for the first time, Brierley held the warmth in. Spring did not arrive with blooming flowers and singing larks at Brierley Hall. It arrived with mud. Thick, sucking, relentless mud that threatened to swallow the heavy carts carrying the oak paneling for the grand staircase. Josephine sat at a makeshift desk in the library. The room was empty of books, smelling sharply of wet earth and linseed oil. She stared at the ledger. The numbers did not care about her determination. The numbers were entirely devoid of romance. She was £80 short for the plasterers, and Mr. Dawson's crew hadn't been paid for 3 weeks. Dawson had said nothing, but Josephine had seen him quietly hand half his supper to the youngest apprentice the night before. She slammed the ledger shut. Dust puffed into the air. By noon she was sitting in the polished, mahogany-panelled office of Mr. Harrison, the chief creditor at the Oakhaven Bank. Her boots, though scrubbed, left a faint crust of dried dirt on the pristine Persian rug. Harrison steepled his fingers. He was a man who sweated profusely, even in the chill of March, and he refused to meet her eye. "Lady Josephine, I must confess my hands are tied," Harrison said, his voice a slick, apologetic drone. "The bank has extended you every courtesy based on your late father's historical standing, but extending a further line of credit against an unlivable property is simply beyond my authority. The roof is finished, the east wing is stabilized, it is not unlivable," she said evenly. She kept her hands folded in her lap to hide the tremor in her fingers. "I merely require a bridging loan until the autumn harvest. The tenant farms are barely yielding enough to feed the livestock." Harrison interrupted, finally looking up. "No, my lady, I cannot." Josephine swallowed the bitter taste of panic. "I see. However," Harrison added quickly, his eyes darting to a sealed envelope on his desk. An arrangement was proposed this morning. An anonymous benefactor has offered to guarantee a line of credit on your behalf. Up to £500. Josephine froze. The air in the stuffy office suddenly felt very thin. Anonymous? Quite. Does this anonymous benefactor happen to own 3,000 acres bordering my estate to the south? Does he ride a black gelding and view the world as a balance sheet? Harrison tugged at his collar. Client confidentiality, my lady. I cannot say. Tear it up. Harrison blinked. I beg your pardon? Tear the guarantee up, Mr. Harrison. I will not be a charity case, nor will I be a pet project for a bored peer. Josephine stood. Her legs felt weak, but her spine was a rod of steel. Good day. She walked out of the bank, the bell jingling merrily above the door, mocking her. She didn't go back to Brierley. She turned her horse toward Alverton Park. Simon's estate was a masterclass in aggressive wealth. The gravel drive was meticulously raked. The lawns were impossibly green. The stone facade of the manor house gleamed under the pale spring sun. She didn't wait to be announced. She marched past a sputtering butler, her heavy boots striking the marble floors of the foyer like gunshots, and pushed open the double doors to the billiard room. Simon was there, leaning over the green baize table, a cue stick in hand. He wore his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. He looked up as the doors banged against the walls. I prefer a knock, Josephine, but I suppose knocking requires an intact door, something you lack practice with. He took his shot. The red ball clattered into the corner pocket. £500! She demanded, stalking into the room. Simon didn't flinch. He handed his cue to a silent footman and gestured for the man to leave. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him. Harrison is an idiot, Simon muttered, walking over to a side table to pour a glass of water. I explicitly told him not to mention the guarantee. He didn't. He has no spine. It wasn't hard to guess. Who else has the money and the arrogance to interfere in my business? I was trying to keep your masons from starving, Simon said, turning to face her. His voice was dangerously quiet. Dawson is a good man. He shouldn't suffer because his employer is too proud to admit she is drowning. I am not drowning. You are £80 in the red this month alone, Simon shouted, the sudden volume making her jump. He closed the distance between them, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. You have sold everything, Josephine. You have ruined your hands, you have ruined your reputation. And for what? A pile of rocks? It is my pile of rocks, she hissed, stepping up to him, refusing to back down. And I will not owe you. I know how you operate, Simon. You buy debt. You leverage it. If I take your money, you own me. You own Brierley, just through a different piece of paper. Simon stared down at her. Her chest was heaving beneath her worn riding habit. Her eyes were furious, wide, and glassy with unshed tears she was too stubborn to let fall. He wanted to yell at her again. He wanted to tell her she was paranoid. But the devastating truth was she was entirely right. That was exactly how he operated. It was how he had built his fortune. But as he looked at her, he realized with a sickening jolt that he didn't want to own her debt. He just wanted her to stop looking so damn tired. Fine, Simon said, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. No guarantee. You sink or swim on your own, Lady Josephine, but do not come crying to my doorstep when the bailiffs lock you out. I would rather freeze on the moors, she replied, turning on her heel. She walked out. Simon watched the empty doorway long after she was gone, the silence of his massive, perfect house suddenly ringing in his ears. April brought a fragile warmth, and with it the frantic push to finish the interior. The smell of wet plaster and sawdust replaced the scent of rot at Brierley. Josephine found the £80. She went into the cellars, armed with a crowbar, and pried up the flagstones in the old wine vault. She sold the 24 bottles of century-old brandy her father had somehow forgotten to drink. It was enough to pay Dawson and hire the plasterers for the drawing room. She was in the drawing room on a Tuesday afternoon, standing on a wooden crate. She was sanding the newly installed oak molding around the massive windows. The repetitive motion was numbing, a physical distraction from the constant grinding anxiety in her gut. "You are sanding against the grain." Josephine's hand slipped. The rough sandpaper skidded, and a sharp, jagged piece of oak drove itself deep into the meat of her palm. She gasped, dropping the sanding block, and clamped her other hand over the wound. Simon stepped into the room. He was dressed in riding leathers, a casual elegance that felt entirely out of place amidst the scaffolding and drop cloths. He froze when he saw her doubled over, her shoulders tense. "What did you do?" he demanded, the boredom instantly vanishing from his voice. "Nothing," she ground out, squeezing her eyes shut against the sharp, throbbing pain. "Just a splinter." Simon crossed the room in 3 long strides. He grabbed her wrist, ignoring her attempt to pull away. He pried her fingers open. Blood was welling up, thick and dark, around a thick shard of wood buried in her palm. "Christ, Josephine," he swore softly. "I'm fine. I just need to pull it out." She reached for it with her left hand, her fingers shaking. "Don't touch it. You'll break it off under the skin." Simon's grip on her wrist shifted, his long fingers wrapping securely around her forearm. "Sit down." He didn't wait for her to comply. He guided her off the crate and forced her to sit on a canvas-covered bench. He knelt on the dusty floor in front of her. "Dawson!" Simon barked over his shoulder. "Bring a clean cloth and a basin of water. Now!" Josephine stared at the top of Simon's head. His dark hair was slightly messy from the wind. He was kneeling in white plaster dust, ruining his expensive breeches, and he didn't seem to care. Dawson hurried in with a tin basin and a ragged but clean towel. He took one look at Simon kneeling and wisely said nothing, setting the items down and retreating quickly. Simon dipped the cloth in the cold water. "This is going to sting," he warned, his voice low. He washed the blood away with surprising gentleness. His hands, usually so harsh and commanding, were steady. He examined the splinter, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's deep," he murmured. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I have to pull it fast. Look away." "I am not a child, Simon. Just do it." He didn't argue. He grasped the end of the splinter between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't hesitate. With a sharp, precise tug, he pulled it free. Josephine sucked in a harsh breath, her whole body jerking, but she didn't make a sound. Simon immediately pressed the damp cloth hard against the wound to staunch the fresh flow of blood. He kept his hand firmly over hers, applying pressure. They sat there in silence. The house was quiet, the workmen taking their midday meal. The only sound was the distant call of a crow and the heavy, synchronized rhythm of their breathing. Josephine looked down at their joined hands. Simon's skin was warm, his grip grounding. She realized how close he was. She could smell the leather of his jacket, the sharp tang of bergamot soap, and the faint, underlying scent of horses. "Why do you keep coming here?" she asked softly. The fight had drained out of her, leaving only a hollow exhaustion. Simon didn't look up. He kept his eyes fixed on her palm. "I like to observe train wrecks. It's a morbid fascination." "Liar." Simon finally lifted his head. His dark eyes locked onto hers. The cynical mask he wore like a second skin was slipping, cracking under the weight of the damp, dusty air between them. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, "I keep waiting for you to fail, and you refuse to do it. It is entirely infuriating. I'm sorry to disappoint you. You don't disappoint me, Josephine." The words slipped out before he could stop them. They hung in the air, heavy and raw. He slowly lifted the cloth. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish crawl. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pristine, monogrammed linen handkerchief, and wrapped it tightly around her hand, tying it off at her wrist. His fingers lingered against her pulse. It was beating frantically against his thumb. "You need to stop working for the day," he ordered, pulling his hand away and standing up. He brushed the plaster dust from his knees, the abrupt movement shattering the fragile intimacy. "I have to finish the trim," she said, cradling her bandaged hand against her chest. "The trim can wait. If you get an infection, you won't be able to hold a hammer, let alone swing one." Simon looked around the room. The plaster was smooth, the oak was rich and dark. It was starting to look like a grand house again. He hated it. He hated that she was succeeding, because it meant she was slipping further away from the desperate woman he could easily control. "Go inside, Josephine," he said, turning toward the doorway, "before I tie you to a chair myself." He walked out, leaving her alone in the massive, quiet room. Josephine looked down at the fine linen wrapped around her bruised, calloused hand. The white fabric was already blooming with a small red stain. She pressed it against her cheek, closed her eyes, and breathed in the scent of bergamot. By July, Brierley Hall was unrecognizable from the rotting corpse it had been a year ago. The slate roof gleamed, the windows were whole and polished. The grand drawing room smelled of beeswax and fresh paint. It was a triumph. It was also a tomb. Josephine stood in the center of the grand hall. It was beautiful, but it was empty. The money from the brandy had finished the plastering, but there was nothing left for furniture, for rugs, for life. Worse, the final balloon payment on her father's oldest, most vicious debt was due on the 1st of August. £600. She didn't have 600 pence. The ton had descended upon the countryside for the summer season, bringing their gossip and their extravagant carriages. The whispers in the village were deafening. The mad Lady Josephine built a castle she can't afford to furnish, sleeping on the floor of a palace. When the stiff, gold-embossed invitation to the Duke of Alverton's summer ball arrived, Josephine almost threw it in the fire. "You should go." Dawson was standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. He had finished the last of the stonework on the terrace that morning. "I have nothing to wear, Mr. Dawson, and I have no desire to be the evening's entertainment." "You built this house with your own 2 hands, my lady," the old mason grunted. "You bleedin' bled for it. Don't let them lot think you're hiding in shame. You go. You hold your head up. Let 'em see what a real backbone looks like." Josephine looked at the invitation. Then she looked at the empty hall. 3 nights later, the Alverton estate was ablaze with light. Carriages lined the drive for a mile. Music drifted over the manicured lawns, a sharp contrast to the silence of Brierley. Josephine stepped out of a hired hackney cab. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk. It was her mother's, drastically altered by Josephine's own clumsy, bandaged fingers to fit the current style. It lacked the lace and jewels the other women wore, but it clung to her frame, stark and elegant. Her only jewelry was a simple black velvet ribbon around her throat. She walked up the grand steps, ignoring the stares of the footman. The ballroom was a sea of pastel silks, sparkling diamonds and suffocating perfume. As Josephine entered, the laughter nearest the doors died down. The silence rippled outward like a stone dropped in a pond until half the room was staring at her. She kept her chin high. She did not fidget. She walked toward the edge of the room, feeling like a ghost haunting a feast. "I didn't think you would come." Simon materialized from the crowd. He was breathtaking in stark black evening wear, a stark contrast to the colorful peacocks of the ton. His eyes swept over her, taking in the outdated silk, the proud tilt of her head, the bare skin of her neck. Something hot and possessive flared in his chest, instantly suppressed. I ran out of nails to pound into the floorboards, she replied, her voice cool and steady. I needed a distraction. They are staring at you. Let them. They have nothing better to do. Their lives are very small, Simon, despite their large bank accounts. A slow, genuine smile spread across Simon's face. It transformed him, erasing the cynical edge and revealing something dangerously charming. Careful, Josephine. You are beginning to sound like me. God forbid. The orchestra struck up a waltz. The floor began to fill. Dance with me, Simon said. Josephine stared at him. You don't dance. I don't dance with them, he corrected. He held out his hand, his large aristocratic hand. She looked at it. She knew the eyes of 200 people were boring into her back. She placed her hand in his. He pulled her onto the floor. When his hand settled on her waist, it was firm, a brand of heat through the thin silk of her gown. He steered her into the spinning crowd with effortless, brutal grace. You rebuilt the house, Simon said quietly as they turned, his mouth inches from her ear. I did! But it is empty. Josephine stiffened. It is clean. It is whole. It is a shell, Josephine, and you are out of time. Simon's grip tightened slightly. He wasn't mocking her. He sounded almost angry. The 1st of August is next week. The creditors will seize the estate. They will sell the land. They will gut the house for the raw materials you just installed, and you will be left with nothing. Why do you care? She snapped, keeping her smile fixed for the watching crowd, but her eyes were furious. This is what you wanted. You told me it would be a ruin. You told me I would fail. You should be gloating. I don't want to gloat. Simon spun her out, catching her hand and pulling her sharply back against his chest. The breath knocked out of her. I want you to stop being so goddamn stubborn and let me help you. By buying my debt? By owning me? By marrying me. The words dropped between them like an anvil. Josephine missed a step. Her boot caught the edge of his shoe. Simon caught her instantly, his arm wrapping entirely around her waist, holding her flush against him in the middle of the crowded ballroom. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she thought it might crack her sternum. What? She breathed. Simon stared down at her. His mask was completely gone. The cynicism, the boredom, the calculated coldness, it was all stripped away, leaving a raw, terrifying intensity. Marry me, he repeated, his voice a low, rough command. The debt becomes mine. Brierley remains yours. You can fill it with all the ugly French furniture you desire. You are insane, she whispered, pushing weakly against his chest. He didn't budge. I am entirely rational, Simon countered, leaning in until his forehead nearly touched hers. You are the only woman I have ever met who doesn't bore me to death. You are ferocious. You are entirely maddening, and I cannot sleep for wondering what wall you are going to tear down next. We are a logical match. Love is not a logic puzzle, Alverton. Love is a myth invented by poets to sell books. Simon said sharply. This is reality. You need capital. I need a duchess who will not faint when a horse throws a shoe. It is a mutually beneficial contract. Josephine stared at him. It was the most unromantic proposal in the history of England. It was cold, it was calculated, and it was entirely Simon. But as she looked into his dark eyes, she saw the faint tremor in his jaw. She saw the white-knuckled grip of his hand on hers. He was lying. It wasn't a business transaction to him, no matter how desperately he tried to dress it up as one. He was terrified. Let me go, she said quietly. Simon froze. The hope that had been rising in his chest plummeted, crashing into cold, hard reality. He slowly opened his hand, letting his arm drop from her waist. Josephine stepped back. The music swelled around them, cheerful and mocking. "I didn't rebuild Brierley to trade it for a title, Simon," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but her eyes resolute. "And I won't be another line item in your ledger." She turned and walked off the dance floor, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the stares. She walked out of the ballroom, out of the grand house, and into the cool summer night. Simon stood alone amidst the spinning crowd, watching her go. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Alverton had made an offer, and the market had rejected it. He realized with a sickening sense of clarity that all his wealth, his land, and his arrogance were entirely useless. He had lost her. August arrived with a suffocating, breathless heat that settled over the countryside like a heavy woolen blanket. The newly polished windows of Brierley Hall trapped the sun, turning the empty rooms into beautiful, airless ovens. Josephine sat on the floor of the grand drawing room. There was no furniture, there were no rugs, there was only the gleaming expanse of the restored oak floorboards and the sharp, clean smell of lemon wax. It was noon. The carriage from Oakhaven Bank was due at 1. She wore her faded morning dress. She had scrubbed her face and pinned her hair back in a severe, tidy knot. She would not let Mr. Harrison and the bailiffs find her looking like a victim. She had fought a war, and she had lost the final battle, but she would surrender her sword with her spine straight. At 12:30, the crunch of gravel echoed through the open windows. Josephine closed her eyes. She placed her palms flat against the warm oak floorboards, memorizing the grain, feeling the solid, unyielding reality of what she had built. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirts, and walked to the front hall. The heavy front doors, hung perfectly on brass hinges, varnished to a mirror shine, stood open to catch the breeze. Mr. Harrison stood on the threshold. He was entirely alone. There were no bailiffs, there were no wagons waiting to strip the lead from the roof. He was dabbing his glistening forehead with a handkerchief, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Harrison," Josephine said, stopping at the base of the grand staircase. "You are early." "Lady Josephine." Harrison swallowed hard, stepping inside. His eyes darted nervously around the immaculate, empty hall. Yes. I felt it best to deliver the documents personally. I am aware of the procedure. You take the keys, and I take a bag." "No, my lady. You misunderstand." Harrison reached into his leather satchel. His hands were trembling slightly. He pulled out a thick sheaf of papers bound in red ribbon and held them out to her. "These are the discharge papers. Your father's debts are settled. In full." Josephine did not reach for them. She stared at the red ribbon as if it were a coiled snake. "Settled," she repeated, her voice deadened. "By whom?" "The benefactor wishes to remain anonymous." "Do not insult my intelligence, Mr. Harrison. Simon Northcott bought the debt. He executed his threat." Her chest tightened. A cold, creeping numbness spread from her stomach. "When does he take possession?" Harrison shook his head violently. "He didn't buy the debt, Lady Josephine. He paid it. He discharged it entirely. He requested the deed be verified in your name, free and clear of all encumbrances. The bank has no further claim on Brierley Hall, nor does the Duke." Josephine finally took the papers. They felt heavy, weighed down by legal seals and signatures. She flipped to the final page. Paid in full. Account closed. There was no transfer of ownership. There was no hidden clause. "Why?" she whispered, staring at the ink. "I cannot speak to the Duke's motives, my lady," Harrison said, backing towards the door. He merely walked into my office yesterday morning, drafted a check that nearly emptied our vault reserves, and told me that if I ever bothered you again, he would buy the bank and fire me. Good day to you." Harrison fled. Josephine stood alone in her perfect, paid-for house. She had won. She had beaten the ruin, she had beaten the creditors, and she kept her home. She walked into the drawing room and looked out the window toward the rolling green hills of the Alverton estate. Simon hadn't conquered her. He had removed the battlefield entirely. He had taken away her fight, her purpose, and the very thing that bound them together. He hadn't bought her obedience. He had purchased her freedom, knowing it meant she would never have to look at him again. Josephine crumpled the thick parchment in her hand. She did not feel victorious. She felt entirely, devastatingly hollow. For 3 weeks, Brierley Hall remained silent. Josephine hired a single maid from the village, a quiet girl who helped her scrub the floors and cook meager meals in the massive kitchen. Josephine spent her days walking through the empty rooms, listening to the echo of her own footsteps. She tried to feel relief. She tried to feel the fierce, territorial pride that had kept her going through the freezing winter mud. But all she felt was the ghost of a large, calloused hand holding hers while a splinter was pulled from her flesh. On a Tuesday, she ordered the carriage. She did not go to Oakhaven. She went to London. She sat in the sleek mahogany offices of the Royal Exchange, presenting the deed to Brierley Hall, certified, clear, and attached to architectural reports detailing a fully restored, structurally sound estate. She did not ask for a bridging loan this time. She asked for a mortgage. The London bankers did not care about her father's reputation. They cared about collateral. Brierley Hall, resurrected from the ashes, was excellent collateral. They gave her £800 at a punishing interest rate. She took the draft, wrapped it in oilcloth, and rode back to Yorkshire. It was raining when she arrived. Not a gale, but a steady, cold autumn drizzle that turned the roads to grey soup. It was fitting, she thought, as she directed the hired carriage up the immaculate gravel drive of Alverton Park. She didn't knock. The butler, a towering man with a face like granite, tried to block her path in the foyer. "My lady, His Grace is not receiving visitors. He is in the library." "Excellent," Josephine said, sidestepping the man with the practiced agility of someone who had dodged falling masonry for a year. She marched down the corridor and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library. Simon was sitting behind a massive desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. The room was dark, lit only by a dying fire and a single lamp. He looked awful. The sharp, arrogant lines of his face were drawn and exhausted. He hadn't shaved in days, a dark shadow of stubble clinging to his jaw. He looked up as the doors banged open. He froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. Josephine walked straight to his desk. Her cloak was dripping water onto his priceless Persian rug. She didn't care. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the oilcloth, unwrapped the bank draft, and slammed it down onto the polished wood directly in front of him. £600, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. With interest. Simon stared at the paper. He didn't touch it. He slowly set his glass down. "What is this, Josephine?" "It is my debt. You paid it. I am paying you back." "I discharged the debt. I didn't purchase it." "It amounts to the same thing," she shouted, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. "You thought you could just quietly save me. You thought you could absolve me of my ruin without my consent. I will not be your charity case, Simon. I told you that." Simon stood up. He was taller, broader, and the exhaustion radiating from him only made him look more dangerous. "It wasn't charity." "Then what was it? Pity? Guilt?" "It was a surrender." The word stopped her cold. Josephine stared at him, her chest heaving. Simon walked around the desk. He didn't stop until he was inches from her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and the sharp, familiar scent of bergamot. "You refused to marry me," he said, his voice a low, rough scrape in the quiet room. "You refused my money. You refused my help. You were perfectly willing to let Brierley be ripped apart by vultures rather than owe me a single goddamn thing." He reached out, his fingers hovering over the wet wool of her cloak, before dropping back to his side. He curled his hands into fists. I realized, Simon continued, staring down at her with a brutal, naked honesty that terrified her, that if the bank took the house it would break you, and if I bought the house you would hate me for the rest of your life, so I paid them to walk away. I gave you your house, Josephine, because it was the only way to keep the light in your eyes. You took away my agency, she whispered. I took away the gun pointed at your head, he fired back. Do you think I wanted to do it? Do you think it is easy for me to sit in this oversized mausoleum, knowing you are a mile away, living in an empty shell, and I can't do a thing to help you because your pride is thicker than your stone walls? Josephine looked at the bank draft on the desk. She had mortgaged her soul to London to pay him back, to keep the ledger balanced, to prove she didn't need him. I got a mortgage, she said quietly, from the Royal Exchange. Brierley is collateral again. If I miss a payment, they will take it. Simon closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. You are a fool. I am independent. You are alone, he corrected harshly, opening his eyes. And so am I. Is this what you want, Josephine? A balanced ledger? We are square now. You owe me nothing. You can take your carriage back to your empty, perfect house and freeze to death in it. And I can stay here. He turned away from her, walking back toward the fire. The dismissal was absolute. He had laid down his arms, and he was waiting for her to leave. Josephine stood perfectly still. The rain lashed against the tall windows. She looked at the broad, tense line of his back. She thought of the cold rooms at Brierley. She thought of the silence that deafened her every night. She had spent a year building walls. She knew exactly how to tear them down. She walked over to the desk, picked up the bank draft for £600 and held it over the glass chimney of the oil lamp. The edge of the paper caught instantly. Simon turned at the sudden flare of light. His eyes widened as he watched the flame consume the parchment. What are you doing? He demanded, lunging forward. Josephine dropped the burning paper onto a silver tray on the desk, watching it curl and turn to black ash. I am burning the ledger, she said. She turned to face him. He had stopped halfway across the room, staring at her in utter disbelief. You just burned your mortgage, he said, his voice flat with shock. You still owe the Royal Exchange, and you just destroyed the capital. I suppose I will need a very wealthy husband to bail me out, Josephine said. Her voice was shaking, but she did not look away. Someone pragmatic, someone who doesn't mind a wife who knows how to mix mortar. Simon didn't move. He stared at her, searching her face for the punchline, for the prideful trap. He found only the same fierce, feral determination that had kept her digging through the dirt for a year. But this time, she wasn't fighting the house. She was fighting for him. Josephine, he breathed. You said love is a myth invented by poets? She said, taking a step toward him. But you laid bricks in a freezing gale to keep my roof from collapsing. You pulled wood from my hand. You gave me my home and asked for nothing in return. If that is pragmatism, Simon, then I want it. Simon crossed the remaining distance between them. He didn't hesitate this time. He took her face in his hands, his thumb sweeping over her cheekbones. I am arrogant, he warned her, his voice rough. I am cynical, and I am entirely unused to being challenged. I am stubborn, she countered, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. I am ruined, and I will argue with you every single day. Good, Simon whispered. He kissed her. It was not a polite, aristocratic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and entirely real. It tasted of rain and whiskey and the undeniable relief of two people who had finally stopped fighting themselves. Josephine kissed him back, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. The cold, empty dread that had lived in her chest for a year finally fractured and fell away, leaving only a fierce, blinding heat. When Simon finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing heavily. A low, genuine laugh rumbled in his chest. "You are going to bankrupt me," he murmured. "I am going to furnish my drawing room," she corrected, "with your money, and I will not tolerate ugly French furniture." The chandeliers in Brierley Hall did not fall. They blazed. 1,000 beeswax candles reflected off the polished oak paneling, casting a hard, golden light over the grand drawing room. The silk wallpaper, a deep, rich crimson that had taken 6 weeks to arrive from London, was flawless. The massive fireplace crackled with a roaring oak fire, driving back the bitter autumn chill that had once owned this room. The house was alive. It buzzed with the sound of 100 voices, the sharp clink of crystal glasses, and the vibrant, frantic strains of a string quartet playing in the gallery. The ton had returned. They had not come to mock, as they had a year ago, but to marvel. Brierley Hall was no longer a ruin, nor was it a cold, empty shell. It was, as the whispers behind feathered fans now eagerly agreed, the finest house in the county. Josephine stood near the hearth. She held a glass of champagne, her thumb tracing the smooth, cool edge of the crystal. She wore a gown of heavy emerald silk that actually fit perfectly. Her hands were no longer blistered and raw, though a faint white scar remained on her right palm, a quiet, permanent reminder of a splinter, the wood, and the dirt. She watched the crowd. Lady Harwood was currently raving about the intricate plasterwork on the ceiling. Lord Penhaligon was admiring the structural integrity of the window frames. A year ago, these same people had taken bets on which week the roof would finally cave in and crush her. Josephine did not feel vindictive. She just felt deeply, profoundly tired of their noise. She had won, but the victory wasn't for them. "They are drinking all my best wine." Simon materialized beside her. He wore stark, formal black, looking impossibly broad and thoroughly annoyed by the sheer number of people breathing the air in his wife's house. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her. It is my house, Simon," Josephine said, taking a sip of her champagne. "Therefore it is my wine. You merely paid the merchant." "A technicality," he grumbled. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. He ignored the scandalized glance of a passing dowager who clearly thought public affection was beneath a duke. Simon kissed the side of Josephine's head, breathing in the sharp, clean scent of her lavender soap. "Are you satisfied, Duchess? You have successfully forced the entire county to eat their words. I believe I just heard Harwood praise your architectural foresight." "I am satisfied," she agreed. She leaned her weight against him. The solid heat of his body was better than the fire. "Though Mr. Dawson cornered me in the hallway 10 minutes ago. He says the west chimney needs repointing before the December freezes hit." Simon groaned, a low, rumbling sound in his chest. "I absolutely forbid it. I will not have you back on the scaffolding in the freezing rain. Not again. I am a duchess now, Simon. I don't climb scaffolding." Josephine looked up at him, a sharp edge of amusement in her eyes. "I hire men to climb it and I yell at them from the ground." Simon laughed. The cynical, untouchable Duke of Alverton threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, rich sound that cut cleanly through the polite, artificial chatter of the room. Several guests turned to stare, shocked by the display of genuine emotion. He didn't care. He looked down at his wife, his dark eyes stripping away the crowd, the noise, and the silk. He looked at her exactly as he had when she was covered in grey dust and carrying slate in the mud. "A year ago I stood in this exact spot," Simon murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register meant only for her. The floorboards were rotting. There was a tin bucket catching rain. "I told you this place would be rubble." "You did," she agreed smoothly. You were incredibly arrogant. I was a fool. Simon reached out, taking her champagne glass and setting it on the stone mantelpiece. He took both of her hands in his thumbs brushing over the faint scar on her palm. I thought you were digging a grave. I didn't know you were building a foundation. Josephine smiled. The hollow ache that had haunted her for so long was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, grounding warmth. The foundation is solid, Simon. Prove it. The string quartet shifted seamlessly into a slow, sweeping waltz. Simon stepped back. He gave her a formal, deliberate bow. He held out his hand. The old arrogance was still there in the set of his shoulders, but it was tempered by a profound, unshakable devotion. He was no longer a man waiting for her to break. Dance with me, Josephine, the Duke asked. The mocking sneer was completely gone. He was begging for a dance. Josephine placed her hand in his. I thought you didn't dance. I don't, Simon said. He pulled her into his arms, steering her expertly away from the hearth and out into the center of her perfect, enduring house. But for you, I make exceptions. Did Josephine's fierce independence and Simon's cynical devotion capture your heart? If you loved this story of grit, pride, and an enemies-to-lovers romance that was built brick by brick, hit that like button. It helps these stories reach more romance lovers. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who appreciates a strong heroine who fixes her own roof and the brooding duke who falls for her. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another historical drama. Leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment between Josephine and Simon?